Democrats are renewing their efforts in support of reparations for Black Americans. Now, the effort was reignited last year after the death of George Floyd and the BLM movement. But now they're adding a twist to their approach: coronavirus. During a House panel last week, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee used COVID-19 as an example of the racial disparities in our country.
Interestingly enough, a recent peer-reviewed study from Harvard Medical School suggests that reparations for African Americans could have cut COVID-19 transmission and infection rates both among Blacks and the population at large. Their analysis, based on Louisiana data, determined that if reparation proposals had been implemented before the COVID-19 pandemic, narrowing the wealth gap, COVID-19 transmission rates in the state's overall population could have been reduced by anywhere from 31 to 68%. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record the Harvard article.
Without objection, it shall be
Since our last hearing, we have also seen hundreds of thousands. Since our last hearing, we have also seen hundreds of thousands peacefully take to the streets in support of Black lives and accountability for law enforcement. Many of these protesters carried signs in support of H.R. 40 and made the important link between policing reform and the movement for reparative justice.
Because when all else fails, blame it on COVID-19 and systemic racism, right? And in case you didn't know, President Joe Biden is giving his support to the study of reparations for Black Americans. So which will he push first, the massive COVID-19 relief package or the reparations that would supposedly help the Black community with COVID-19? Joining me now from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Chairman of American Center for Education and Knowledge, Robert Chernin. Robert, thank you so much for joining me. Robert, I'm sure you've seen this pop up over the years. We have the Democrats on the left that are constantly pushing for reparations, yet no one wants to give any details on exactly how that will work, who's owed the money, and who deserves to pay for it. For example, my mom grew up in Mexico. She's from Mexico. She's an immigrant in this country. Does she have to pay into the reparations as well?
That's a good question, Stephanie. First of all, thank you for having me on and joining you today. I think it's a canard, right? I mean, I think what Congresswoman Jackson-Lee and others who are pushing reparation is really all about is this victim mentality we have, who to blame, and there's really no direct link. I mean, look, we both know the truth. You can look on the internet and find almost any article to support any position at this point. There is no direct link. And who are you going to make reparations to? How many generations back do we go, and where does it end? It's sort of a very slippery how high is up or up the down staircase kind of argument. But it's very typical with the Democrats. They're just looking to blame and then looking to keep the Republicans on the defensive. This is their latest push.
Yeah, and it's obvious here we've seen the Democrats trying to take advantage of this pandemic in all sorts of ways, especially when it comes to the relief packages for America. Rather than just having that money directly for Americans, they want to put in all this pork and all this other stuff, and they use coronavirus as an excuse to push their liberal agenda through. That being said, I mean, I think it's kind of a distraction. At the end of the day, they need to keep things separate. And what's also lost in this conversation is the Democrats still aren't really focusing on the origins of the virus. There's a lot of questions where it happened. We have China and Biden kind of defending China and giving them a pass. And so, you know, a lot of us want to make sure that this never happens again and that China is held accountable for the lack of transparency from the very beginning of this pandemic, which could have saved thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives.
Absolutely, Stephanie. If you believe the Chinese or the World Health Organization, America is to blame for everything. Look, it's in the Biden's administration's best interest to keep the focus off of China. I think it's no coincidence that President Biden's I think it was his third phone call, he called President Xi, and yet I think it was almost a month before he called Prime Minister Netanyahu from Israel. That tells you a lot about the focus of the Biden administration and where they're going to place China. And there's so much concern, there should be so much concern about trying to understand the relationship between President Biden, what I call Biden Inc., and China. But to leave it there and just to blame it or try to focus on that, it's a much broader issue that's going on here in terms of China's move to supplant the United States as the supreme world power. That's really what's going on here.
Yeah, and you see a difference on how the administration is handling China now versus the Trump administration. We have Biden right now who's trying to, quote, like reset relations with China. But again, they're kind of looking the other way on serious issues, even like the Uyghur camps in China. We heard Biden say during a town hall that it was like a cultural norm. No, it's not.
Look, this goes back to Tiananmen Square when the world looked the other way at the human rights violations of China. This is no different. If you really want to look at sort of the genesis of when Chinese influence really began to penetrate U.S. politics or American culture, you have to go back to the 90s and the Clintons, President Bill Clinton's reelection in 1996. And there was Johnny Wong, there was the Buddhist temple fundraiser. So the Chinese have been trying to use soft power to influence American culture and institutions and deflect focus on their human rights violations, among other things. There's a lot we should be looking at here.
How concerned are you of the threat of China? We seem to not spend a lot of time discussing the real threat from China. That is, they're not necessarily an ally. I mean, they're an enemy and they're on a mission.
Anyone who doesn't understand that this is a new Cold War with China has not been paying attention. I mean, think about it. When you look at the influence that the spies have had on members of Congress, high-ranking members of Congress, no one seems to care or no one seems to focus on it. China now owns, either directly or indirectly through state-owned companies or through the Chinese Communist Party directly, over 2,400 U.S. companies. And let's count some of them. IBM, Genworth Financial, Blackstone, one of the largest hedge funds groups in Wall Street. And then they recently bought AMC, 2012, I think, AMC Entertainment, 8,800 theaters. And you have to ask yourself, why would they buy? I mean, people don't go to movies that much anymore. Why would they really buy or want to buy an entertainment company for $2.6 or $2.8 billion? Because they're trying to control the message. They're trying to control what we hear, what we see, and what we don't see really is the real issue. So there's a lot that we need to be focusing on here, and I just don't see the Democrats doing that.
Yeah, a lot of questions. I mean, even their influence over social media, tech, et cetera. And you were talking about our members of Congress who may have been influenced by the Chinese government. Even there hasn't even been any sort of hearings on this whole like spy ordeal with Eric Swalwell and Fang Fang. And I'm surprised that he didn't even have to resign out of his committee. So anyways, we'll be keeping a close eye on that. We appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Nice to join you. Thanks.
Thanks. Coming up next, assessing the widespread damage